That's why
Yeah, that's right. One day I'll be that.
Yes, Chief Humphrey, Chief of Police here, and a number of his officers are also here. You know that Chief Humphrey is very active in the community organizing and being part of the dialogue here on campus around issues of race and interactions with our police force. We really appreciate his commitment to that. My name is Cindy Simon Rosenthal. I'm the director of the Parallel Congressional Research and Studies Center, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce our speaker this morning. He is here for double duty. He's actually been advising our doctoral students who are defending his dissertation this afternoon. We're pleased to have him participate in that capacity. But we also asked him while he's visiting our campus to give a talk. I think you're going to find that Frank Baumgartner is really one of the leading and most distinguished scholars on public policy. He is the Richard J. Richardson Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina. He's the first person to hold that professorship. He is from Detroit. I think to ask me if you're a Tigers fan. I'm a Tigers fan going back myself. He has held academic positions at the University of Iowa, Texas A&M, and Penn State, and he's also been a visiting professor at a significant number of institutions, including the universities of Michigan, Washington, Bergen, Norway, Aberdeen, Scotland, and several others. He's well traveled around the world. With Brian Jones, he created a project called the Policy Agendas Project, which really continues to co-direct that, and it has also an international comparative politics component to it, and looking at with participation by scholars in 23 countries around the world. His work has been published in a variety of well-recognized and honored and celebrated works. With Brian Jones, who wrote The Politics of Information, The Politics of Attention, How Government Prioritizes Problems, and Agendas and Instability in Politics. I would say for our graduate students, all three of those are required reading for those in American politics and policy. In 2008, his book, The Decline of the Death Penalty and the Discovery of Innocence, was published and it was awarded one of the American Political Science Association's Distinguished Award, the Gladys and Cameron Award, which recognizes the best book in national policy, U.S. national policy. His current research projects focus on race, and in particular focus on the death penalty and on interactions between police and citizens in traffic stops. With his colleagues at the University of North Carolina, he is writing a book tentatively entitled A Deadly Symbol, Race and Capital Punishment in North Carolina. This morning's work will focus on his work with interactions between police and citizens at traffic stops. Obviously, this work is timely, it's provocative, it's salient for the things that are going on today across the country, starting last fall in Ferguson, obviously the turmoil that we're facing right now in Baltimore. So it's my privilege to introduce, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Frank Baumgartner.
issues on why certain issues hit the front page of the newspapers and what effects that have. How do we think about politics? How do we frame things? That's all very abstract, and I'm interested, great interest to about 150 people around the country who are engaged in programs in political science and how that work. This project stems from another line of my work, which is much more engaged with very current events, about the death penalty, about race and traffic stuff. So I just want to give a little introduction about how I got involved in this because I'm a political scientist, not a criminologist, and I think that might come through a little bit. And I hope that that's a good thing for this debate because it gives me a different perspective. But I have a lot to learn also from the criminal justice side. By the way, I want to mention I'm very glad to see so many officers and chief here. It's very nice to see that interest. In 2008, as was mentioned, I published a book about the death penalty, and the issue there was how has the death penalty been framed, and how the discovery that there's a very number, now there's been 152 people in the United States exonerated from death row because they were innocent. And we've executed 1,400 people, and we've exonerated 152. So that's a many times. So that issue of potential of executing a innocent person, and according to the research that I did, has transformed the nature of our collective understanding of what death penalty is all about and whether we can expect a government program to be run flawlessly every time, never make a mistake. That, you can have your opinions about the death penalty, and I have mine, but my book was about how that discovery of innocence has changed the nature of the national discussion about the death penalty. Statistically led to dramatic decline in disputes. Because I had written about the death penalty, this is from a very political science perspective, I was able then to meet a number of attorneys when I moved to North Carolina in 2009 involved in that issue. And the one thing about attorneys that I've learned is none of them know how to do numbers. They don't do statistics. They work on their case, their client, and they don't want to know about anything else. Just their client. Well, I don't do that. I work on very large databases of custom statistical analysis. So that's made me the favorite person for pro bono consulting an entire group of North Carolina attorneys, defense attorneys in particular. So they asked me if I would participate without pay, of course, for on a task force into a racial profiling in North Carolina. Let me just see if I can. Okay. Before I do that, let me just give one little bit more of introduction. They asked me if I could analyze the data that's been collected since January 1st, 2000 in North Carolina relating to every traffic stop in the state. In 1999, North Carolina was the first state in the country to mandate the collection of demographic information for every traffic stop. There's probably half a dozen states now that have a similar program, but North Carolina has the longest standing such program. There's now 18 million observations in the database, and the state Department of Justice gave me a CD that had all that. Can everybody hear me back? So I got all this data, used the North Carolina supercomputer to make sense of it, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is a timely issue, and the way that I framed the paper that's currently under revision, that's just about ready to go out to a journal, we framed it around the Department of Justice's report about the Ferguson Police Department. And this is just a summary of what the Department of Justice reported about Ferguson. They said that the agency, the police department, had perverted the traffic enforcement function of the police department into something else, into a racially focused revenue generation machine. That blacks in Ferguson are the majority of the population, but they were a much higher percentage of traffic stops, citations, and arrests. Furthermore, that compared to whites, blacks Ferguson is unique. There can't be any other country where the police department would have perverted the function of traffic enforcement duties in such a manner. And I think Ferguson is an outlier, but it's by no means unique. And that's what I want to talk about today. Some elements I think may be unique. Some I don't have data about. For example, I don't know about the revenue generation side of the citations. But I do know about every traffic stop in North Carolina. And so it's easy for me to calculate for each police agency in the state the likelihood that a black driver versus a white driver would be a stop, search, arrested, given a citation, a verbal warning, or what would be the outcome of that stop. I think I already mentioned this. North Carolina is the first state to mandate the state election for the state highway patrol, which constitutes about half of the data. Data are available since January 1st, 2000. Other agencies, any police agency with a population of over 10,000 is mandated to file their reports every year starting 2002. So we have 18 million observations. I'm not going to analyze the period from 2002 through 2013 because when I got the data, 2014 reports are incomplete, so I'm not going to talk about 2014, although I don't think there'll be any significant change. The form that's filled out has demographic information about the driver. It tells why they were stopped, for speeding, running a red light, unsafe driving, vehicle equipment, broken taillight, vehicle regulatory issue, expired tags, why were they stopped, what was the outcome, were they let go with a verbal warning, were they arrested, were they searched, if they were searched, was it a consent search, proper cause search, search after being arrested, etc. Time does not include the location, and it includes an anonymous ID number for the police officer. So I know I can analyze the patterns of searches and stops for each officer, although I don't know who they are. And believe me, I don't want to know. I'm going to be at enough already. On the other hand, while the state makes available the data, our Attorney General's office has never issued a single report about the data, although it was mandated in the law that there be periodic reports. We've never had a report from the North Carolina Attorney General. So I was actually, what the graduate was the first one to do a report, and it showed about a 75% disparity in the likelihood of a black driver will be searched compared to a white driver statewide. And I want to go into more detail about that today. So, we can look at given that you were stopped, what's the probability that you'll be searched, arrested, or given a citation? That's what I'm going to focus on today. And I just want to make clear that I'm not going to focus on who gets stopped, because I don't know who's driving. But I do know who did get stopped, and then given that someone got stopped, I'm going to analyze the likelihood of certain outcomes. And also I can look at individual police officers in an aggregate way. And my focus today is going to be on the black-white comparison, although the data will also allow me to replicate everything I'm going to show you for Hispanic-white comparison. But I have done that. And the reason why I focus on the black-white comparison rather than both is that they're a little bit different. The Hispanic drivers are also targeted, but they're targeted statistically in a different way than black drivers because of an immigration issue. So among black drivers, you'll see the data show that young black men are very highly targeted. Among Hispanics, it's a little more equal. Everybody's every Hispanic driver is targeted to some extent because they may or may not have legal immigration status, and that's unrelated to their age or gender. Whereas what I think is happening in the data that you'll see is related to searching for drug contraband, and that tends to be very focused on young men of color. So Hispanic individual stop based on their age, race, and gender. And the bars, you can see at the very left-hand side, a black male under the age of 20 has about 8% likelihood of making surgery. A black male, 20 to 25, has about a little bit higher. And then a white male has about 4% likelihood of making surgery if he's under the age of 20. And a person like me, over the age of 50, pretty much scot-free. White male over the age of 50 has less than 1% chance of being searched given a traffic stop. And you can see among women, very low rates of search for both races and for all ages, although it also defines as age group. This is for the entire state based on 16 million traffic stops. And this is a little bit more complicated. You can see there's 16 million traffic stops, of which a half a million led to a search. So the total search rate is 3%. Among whites, the search rate is 2.6%, and among blacks, the search rate is 4.57%. The ratio, therefore, is 1 to 1.75. A black driver is 75% more likely to be searched than a white driver. Among consent searches, it's 73%. Probable cause searches, 179%. Incidents of arrest, 41%. And search warrants and protective risks are such small numbers, I'm not going to talk about them today. Okay. Now, I'm going to just look at a few cities to show you the ubiquity of these patterns. And of course, this is North Carolina, so maybe you don't care. That's the best data that we have. So in Charlotte, our city, it's about a 15% probability of being searched for young black men, as opposed to about 6 or 7% for young white men, and less than 1% for many categories of women, especially the older women. In Greensboro, similar pattern, although different numbers. In Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Hartboro, which is contiguous to Chapel Hill where I live, there's over 20% likelihood of being searched if you're a young black man. So these are very consistent patterns. We see them in every city where we look. Depending on how you're stopped, that racial disparity can be higher or lower. So this graph shows the stop purpose, and for Charlotte, it's the top line is driving while impaired. Turns out that's more of a white specialty than a black specialty. And among whites, if you're stopped driving while impaired, and actually more whites are stopped at than blacks or Hispanics, comparatively to other types of stops. Blacks are actually less likely to be searched after a driving while impaired stop. But that's the only kind of stop for which we see this, and we see this every time in every city. Quite consistent. And then reading down, safe movement, investigation, speed limit, other vehicle infraction, vehicle equipment, vehicle registration, stoplight, seatbelt. Seatbelt violations are used. When they're used, blacks have triple, more than a 200% increased likelihood of being searched following a seatbelt violation in these cities in North Carolina. In Raleigh, the pattern is similar, although the ordering of those lines is slightly different, but it's still seatbelts at the bottom and driving while impaired at the top. I can look at each individual police officer. So here is, on the left, for Charlotte, the way to read this graph is each of those dots is a police officer. And the placement of the dot indicates what percent of black drivers did they search on the x-axis, and then what percent of white drivers did that same officer search on the y-axis. And so let me just point you to this here is all those officers where their rate is more than double for black drivers as compared to white drivers. And these few officers here have more than double the rate of searching white drivers. And as you'll notice, there's more of them on the bottom side of the graph than on the top side of the graph. But in any case, the person could be biased in either way, or this might not be biased. There might be a different explanation for it, but there's a statistical disparity that can be shown officer by officer. Fayetteville, I don't know if any of you know Fayetteville, it's a very large marine base. Fayetteville is a pretty tough town, and there's a very high degree of disparity at the individual officer level in Fayetteville. I want to point to a few of these cities. If you look at the upper right-hand corner there, that's Jacksonville, North Carolina, which is in what we call the lowlands, the eastern part of the state. There's only one officer on that force that's even searched on greater than a 1-to-1 ratio. Everybody's below the line of 1-to-1. And many officers, about half the officers on that force, show a disparity of greater than 2-to-1 ratio searching blacks as compared to whites. I could go on about this, but I do believe that from a police chief's perspective, this can be very useful information that now in North Carolina, in any case, is available. I don't know who these officers are, but the chief does. He knows their ID number. And some of these disparities are significant enough that in conversations that I've had with North Carolina police chiefs, they're very interested to know, what assignment do that officer have? Is there a justification for these disparities, or is there some kind of action that needs to be taken? I've also found, interestingly, there's a few officers where the disparities have been so great that defense attorneys at trial have subpoenaed this information and demonstrated that that officer has a pattern of targeting Hispanics or blacks, and that when their client was facing potentially a significant charge for drug possession, for example, and can show that that officer may have targeted them for reasons unrelated to probable cause, but related to these patterns, the district attorney has thrown out charges because they don't feel that they can defend that. So this can be a very costly pattern of disparity in the criminal justice system. Turns out that the state highway patrol, which constitutes, as I mentioned, half of the observations, they seem to be quite less involved in what I think of as the urban drug war. State highway patrol is on the interstate highways, it's in the rural areas of the state. They don't search people. I don't think they're crazy, but they just never search anybody. The overall search rate is 0.6%. 0.6%, less than 1/2 of 1% almost. If you get stopped by a North Carolina highway patrolman, he's going to give you a ticket, and he's going to let you go, and he's going to give someone else a ticket 3 minutes later. That's what they do. And that's what their job is. And so, while we see a similar pattern of targeting young men of color, the rate is so much lower. I showed you, I think Raleigh had 15%, and here it's going up to 1.5% at the extreme. So these are very different patterns. And also, if you look at the right-hand side, the individual officer white driver has a 0.77% likelihood of being searched, black driver 1.2, and that disparity is 55%. 55% disparity in these data is a relatively low disparity, but 55% is still 55%. Across North Carolina, we see a 98% racial disparity in the likelihood of being. I'm sorry, this is for males, right? The differences are so important between the genders that I wanted to focus only on the men here because these differences are more extreme than among the women. So there's 10.3 million male drivers who've been pulled over in this case. If you look at this, these numbers, this ratio, the percent increase likelihood for blacks, I can calculate that number for every agency in North Carolina. And this is the distribution of that number for 225 police agencies across the state. In Ferguson, Missouri, the ratio was 145%. Okay? I'm sorry. The mean ratio here is 1.45. That's the average across all the agencies in North Carolina. In Ferguson, it was 107% increased likelihood, so 2.07. Right? So that line right there represents where would Ferguson fall in the distribution of North Carolina agencies. So it's an outlier. There's 15 agencies in North Carolina that have a disparity greater than the Justice Department found in Ferguson, Missouri. So Ferguson is out in that tail, but it's not the far end of that tail. I think there's plenty more Fergusons if we were to look for them, at least in terms of the statistical pattern of who gets searched once the car is stopped. Now, being a political scientist, I'm not satisfied with simple ratios or percent likelihood, so the form allows us to control for a number of other factors. Your race, whether or not you're Hispanic, how old you are, why did you get stopped. Turns out if you get stopped for drunk driving, they're going to search your car. Period. It's a very, very high likelihood that it's going to be searched. If you get stopped for speeding, it's much less likely that they're going to search your car. So we control for all the stop purposes. We also control for whether or not you were stopped by one of these high disparity officers. That's an officer that had a hollow circle in the graphs that I showed you before, or whether you were stopped by someone who had a pattern of searching that was not high disparity between 1 to 1, or 2 to 1, and 1 to 2. And we also control for the hour of the day and the day of the week. And controlling for all those factors, we find these numbers in this range of cities. Statewide, for the 25 largest police agencies, among men, we find a 75% increased likelihood of search, controlling for why did you get stopped, what time of day was it, day of the week was it, did you get stopped by one of those high disparity officers or not. Now, by controlling for that, we're controlling for what you might call the bad apple theory. If it were the case that it was just a few officers engaging in these statistically disparate patterns of behavior, then by controlling for the high disparity officer among the other officers, there should be no impact. But controlling for that, we still show a 75% increased likelihood. And this is in a statistical model. I know my PhD students in the room, would be interested. It has fixed effects for the 25 largest agencies in North Carolina. Similarly, we can model the same statistical regression for did you get arrested, controlling for all those same factors and also controlling for whether they found contraband. And the effect of race is that you have a 52% increased likelihood of being arrested if you're a black man compared to if you're a white man. These are the statistical results, and you can see it's a lot of numbers. The number we're interested in is this number, twice as likely to be arrested, 9% more likely to get a ticket. And I know my wife never gets a ticket. She street talks her way out of it every time. And I'm a street talker, and after this, she's probably in trouble. Men are 300% more likely to be searched, and then a black man is 86% more likely over and above that. So these are with statistical controls. Now here's the kicker. You might think that these trends would be decreasing over time, but they're not. The likelihood that a black person will get a ticket, pretty flat. The likelihood that they'll be arrested, kind of flat. It's about 50% increased likelihood when we do that regression separately for each year and plot the results. The statistical disparity between search is actually increasing over time. This is, I think, the most surprising result that I have, because while any of the particular numbers that I just showed you, it may surprise you, it may not surprise you, it may confirm your expectations, but this finding that this trend is upwards rather than downwards in time, I think is a little bit surprising and, to my mind, troubling. So I'm going to stop here with these comments. In the Department of Justice report on Ferguson, we asked the question of whether the traffic stops have been used as a pretext for something else. And in that case, it was raising revenue. And there was a lot of things in Ferguson. I don't need to go into it. If we focus on traffic stops as part of the war on drugs and the effort to find small amounts of marijuana or other drugs or other kinds of contraband, I have so far is the question was whether I can notice differences between agencies that are doing community-oriented policing and those that are not. And what I've been doing so far is simply to crunch the numbers for every agency in the state. And we haven't yet gotten to the point of doing a survey of the police agencies, finding out, talking to the police departments themselves about their practices. There is a survey, a national survey of all police agencies that I've access that is publicly available, but it only includes about 30 North Carolina agencies. So that's something we haven't done yet. But I do want to point out that the differences in these rates, where was that slide? These rates, there's quite a range of degree of disparity from agency to agency. I could also show you a similar graph. There's a huge range in the likelihood of being searched. Furthermore, that changes a lot from year to year. So I think there's decisions that are made at the agency level about how aggressively to search cars that apparently change quite dramatically from time to time and from agency to agency. Furthermore, when you look at officer to officer, there's some lazy officers, or maybe they're just on the radar gun, and their job is just to catch speeders, but they never search anybody. I can show you officers that have stopped 1,000 people, and actually my website has a spreadsheet for every officer in the top 25 cities in North Carolina with the numbers of stops and searches for black, whites, and Hispanics. It's pretty interesting. And some of them, they search 3 people per 1,000, and some of them search 30, 40, 50% of the people. And that's without even considering the racial dynamics. Some are quite aggressive, and some are very unlikely to search you. So there's a huge amount of discretion at the officer level, very range of behaviors.
Yeah, your data showed a bump in the racialized disparity in the search rate. It happened around 2006 to 2007, and then the higher rate was kind of maintained after that. And I wondered if you had a hypothesis about what might have caused that, or do you think it's just like an anomaly in general of the trend?
That bump right there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a theory about that bump.
Yes, Dave.
On the seatbelt violations, am I right to assume that the officer typically doesn't know whether you're wearing a seatbelt or not until he or she gets up to the window and sees you?
I don't know. All I know is what they check on that form. And this is what they check on that form. So there's plenty of officers in the room, although I don't think any of you work in North Carolina, but you can only check one stop purpose on the form. So the officer is checking why they stopped them, and these are the possible reasons, speed limit, etc.
There seemed to be a huge, difference in that category. I just wondered if that's, it's one of those violations that's pretty
Yeah, I think
discretionary.
our guys are really trained initially in being in observe observation, and you can actually see a person. When our guys are trained, you can actually see if a person is on a seatbelt or not. So if I'm coming toward you, I can see it. If I'm on the side of you, I can see it. If there are those instances where the windows are tinted very darkly, you can be able to majority of those what the officers observe, and everyone must wear the seatbelt. So that is a violation. I think a lot of times we see it, and that's not real. People don't understand traffic is an enforceable incident for officers. They think officers should only enforce felonies and misdemeanors. Traffic officers' jobs are to enforce traffic and what they observe. So they observe you on the stop sign. They observe you not wearing your seatbelt. They observe that your registration is expired. They observe that you may have not used a signal. Those are enforceable violations, and a lot of people don't understand. Do that.
Thank you for that. And this chart, just to be clear what this is, at the bottom bar there is a seatbelt violation. ID number for the officer is anonymous. And so I don't know anything about, I would love to analyze the differences across kinds of officers by demographic type or years on the force. I think we may end up doing that to some extent in cooperation with some of the major police departments in North Carolina, because I think they're quite interested in understanding these patterns. But as the publicly available data go, it's impossible.
I would be interested in knowing how much of this data is related to departments that have in-car video, body cameras, audio recorders. Is that data available, or have you looked into that?
We have. The question is whether there's relevant data about body cameras and in-car recorders. The answer is I only know what's on that form, so I don't know that. Agency by agency, I know what agency it was, and I have 13 years of data, so we could probably see if there's differences one agency at a time when those reforms might have been in place. And some of the cities, like Charlotte, are large enough that there's very robust data for, there's 1.3 million traffic stops in Charlotte in my database, so that's enough that we can look at it, as they say, every which way from Sunday. So I look forward to doing that.
Let's take a question in the back.
I was just interested, when you were doing your research, did you find any sort of disparity between, say, like whites and Arabs or Asians, and where they fall on the spectrum of like who they stopped frequently and for what?
Yeah, very good question. The question was about Asians and Arabs as compared to whites and similar patterns. The form in North Carolina lists the races are white, black, Indian, Asian, and other. And the ethnicities are Hispanic or not. And there's really just not enough cases to look at American Indians and Asians. So I have
I was just wondering, if we were going to design a new database for Oklahoma, what would be your wish list to have the best database you could have to do your analysis?
Well, definitely you'd want to add to this. One thing I would say is I would like to have the officer ID automatically stamped to the form electronically. Some of the officer IDs that are in my database are things like tough guy, they only appear once in the database, so I can't correlate that with anything. So that's a problem. So I eliminate all the officer IDs that are only used a few times. The location of the stop, and I think some assessment But, you know, our country has a very complicated history of race, and poverty is very strongly associated with race, and poor people drive broken down cars. And so there might be a good explanation for that. It's related not only to race, but also to poverty. And living in a poor neighborhood might mean that you live in a high crime neighborhood. And that's also associated with race. And some of the police practices of targeting where the crime is and going on response to citizen requests to come help patrol our neighborhood are going to be statistically correlated with race. So these are important problems. And I think by shining light on the degree of statistical disparity, I'm not assuming what are the explanations for these disparities, but I'm really happy to see that national conversation go someplace, because I think the next step will have to be explain it. And right now what we're seeing is a lot of focus on the degree, which I think is quite substantial. The degree of disparity, I think, is surprising people. I also think it's important to recognize that our country faces what I would call an empathy gap. I don't get hassled by the police, and I can't even imagine being hassled by the police. And since the day I turned 18, I went to college and kind of cut my hair and cleaned up a little bit, I haven't experienced the slightest unpleasant interaction with a police officer or any other official of authority in my lifetime. It just doesn't happen to me. But there are other Americans where they've not had a good experience. And we can't empathize with each other. You know, I can't put myself in those shoes. I can try to think about it, and that's why I'm here today, because I do think about that kind of thing. But most people can't even imagine, if you're from one of those neighborhoods where the police are having a heavy and relatively aggressive presence and you're going out of color, and you've been stopped 5 times while walking to school, and the police assume that you must be doing something wrong, when in fact you're just coming home for lunch, but you happen to live in the wrong neighborhood. You can't imagine my life of being respectful to the police and expecting the police to treat you with equal respect. There's an empathy gap, and I think we really need to collectively engage in that conversation, as difficult as it is.
Let's take a couple more questions all the way in the back.
Trying to the traffic stop forms, do they have, say, the intersection of where in the city the stop took place? Because that's what you control for all kinds of, is it a white neighborhood, black neighborhood, poor neighborhood, and I'd be really interested to see how those affect as a result.
Yeah, the question is whether there's location information on the form, and the answer is no, there's not. So that's one of the key reforms that I think would always be, just put the geo stamp on in the computer. That would make it very simple to map all these things. I don't think that's a solution to everything, because as I mentioned, just because you happen to live in a bad neighborhood doesn't mean you're a criminal. But it does mean that you're likely to see the police a lot.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you find in like your research and stuff that cities that were major college towns had more stops because it targeted like young black males, or was it a location where they were like more centered in?
Well, Chapel Hill and Carborough are college towns, and they have a pretty high disparity. Durham, I think the issue with college towns is college towns have their own police departments for the university. And I've never quite understood that.
population, have there been any studies that zero in on income level or other indicators of poverty for the person pulled over? Or can you imagine working that set of variables into the collection of data?
I can imagine it. I think what it would involve is more of a follow-up on the individual who was stopped, or maybe follow-up in the case that they were arrested, finding what happened. I can point you to a book that was recently published, I think 2014. The book was called Pulled Over. And it's an excellent book. It's based on a survey of drivers where they have an open sample of black drivers and a sample of white drivers. I think it's in Missouri. It might be Kansas. It's by two professors at the University of Kansas. Three professors at the University of Kansas did it. It was published. And they interviewed people who had had experiences with the police. And it's quite interesting because they look at the make and model of the car. Certain cars attract police attention. Deuce and a quarter attracts more attention than certain other kinds of cars. Older American luxury cars attract more attention. Foreign luxury cars attract less attention. And so these are actually quite racialized indicators that are out there. Anyway, they interviewed people after their experiences with the police, and the minority drivers were quite able to recognize when they had not been profiled. They had been pulled over for speeding, they were speeding, and they got a ticket, and they were treated with respect. And they reported not being happy at getting a ticket, but they didn't report any animosity or feeling of unfairness about that ticket. Whereas when it was the hypothetical taillight stop or something that the driver considered that was probably more contextual rather than something more clear cut, they did report higher. They reported being angry about it. And so that was based on a survey of drivers. That would be a different way to approach this question. But that book is called Pulled Over.
I'm going to cut it off here, and I hope you have found, as I have, this is obviously very challenging, provocative information. I appreciate especially your comments with respect to the empathy gap, which I think is an important one to overcome as we, as communities and policymakers try to address. Please join me.